How's it going, guys? I hope you're all doing well today. And today we're going to start our next unit, which is the Cold War. So today we're going to kind of go over the introduction to the Cold War, just kind of the main ideological and historical background points to the war, if you will. And I would like you to have your Google Doc open because there's a few points in the lecture in which you'll have to pause the video, answer the question on the Google Doc, and then come back to the video later. Okay? Just make sure that you're ready to do that. All right, so quick review, again, on your Google Doc. Go ahead and jot this down. Two questions. Number one, what were the three competing systems of government before World War II? Think about, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Germany, those three, okay? And then which two were left after World War II? Again, pause your video, answer the question, and then proceed. So the Cold War, while it was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union for who would have kind of total global domination economically, politically. It was also about a war over ideas, okay? The reason why it's called the Cold War is that there wasn't that much actual fighting that happened during it. And in fact, there was very little, if any, actual fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are a few instances of, people or planes getting shot down and boats getting fired on, but nothing like a real war. It was more about the ideas and which nation would be able to expand its influence over the most of the world. And so essentially it turned into a race between capitalist democracy and communism, right? The two systems, one in which the individuals, the people have control over the economy and own their own private property versus communism in which the government controls the economy and things are meant to be more for the benefit of everyone rather than the benefit of the individual. So it is very much an ideological war as much as it is a political and military war. So let's look at some historical background real quick to understand kind of how we get to the Cold War. So at the end of World War I, Russia is forced to give up about 25% of its farmland in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. If you guys remember, they left World War I early because of the Russian Revolution. So they leave the war early, and with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they lose a bunch of farmland. And you can see here on the left, this is before World War I. Pay attention to this portion here. Russia has a ton of land here bordering Germany, and this is a lot of their farmland. Okay, remember, a lot of Russia is kind of cold and very difficult to grow good crops on, so this would be very beneficial for them. And then after World War I, the map is redrawn, and they lose a bunch of it. Okay, then we have the Civil War. Okay, in which the White Army is aided by the West. Remember, the White Army was the anti-communist forces, okay? But the Bolshevik Red Army was victorious. So there's already some sort of conflict going on here between the West and the Soviets, right? Eventually it will become the Soviet Union. The West was always kind of supporting the anti-communist side, not helping out the communist regime. And that's essentially what I just said right now. Okay. Then we have World War II. Okay, at first Stalin allies with Hitler, then he switches sides, and that made Western nations distrustful of Stalin. Again, Hitler was the sworn enemy of freedom, of democracy, and Stalin made a deal with him, which essentially allowed Hitler to start World War II. Had Stalin not made this deal, I do think there would have been a very different outcome, or at least a very different course of action in World War II. And so that made the Western nations very distrustful of Stalin. Germany then attacked Russia eventually leading to the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, if you guys remember from our look at World War II, Stalin was pleading the U.S. and the British to help him out as soon as possible to basically help pull German troops away. Well, the U.S. and the British kind of dragged their feet, decided to go to North Africa first, and in the views of Stalin, this was being done on purpose to let the Germans attack the Soviets as long as possible. Is there some truth to that? I'm not 100% sure, but that was definitely a very believable thing in Stalin's mind. Okay, and as we saw, the Russians, the Soviets lost way more people than any other nation in World War II. And then at the end of the war, we have a lot of disagreement over how to rebuild Europe. right? Germany was in ruins, Italy was in ruins, and so the nations that were left over at the end of the war, right, the U.S., Soviet Union, France, Britain, they would have a big say in how to rebuild Europe and prevent another world war from happening. And it turns out that the Soviets and the Americans had very different ideas on how to do that. Okay. One of the major ideological foundations of the Cold War is something that the U.S. believed, which is called the domino theory. So again, think about, you guys have seen a video of it probably, of when you line up the dominoes, knock one over, and they all fall down. That's how Americans viewed, and not just Americans, but many Western allies as well, viewed the Cold War. They viewed that if the communists would knock down one domino, so let's say one country becomes communist, then the countries surrounding it would also most likely become communist. And so it became this, and to be fair, the Soviet Union also probably viewed this domino theory as well, just working in their favor, right? The communists, one of their goals was to spread communism worldwide, because that would give them more control and more influence over the world, right? So for them, it was if one country becomes communist, then the others will do that, so we need to help spread communism. Whereas the US and the West saw that if one country fell, others would fall. They had to stop the dominoes from falling. And so as you see in this image here, right, the West, the American, is stopping, propping up the dominoes, whereas the Viet Cong, which we'll talk about later on, they're the ones trying to push down the dominoes. Now, again, this ideological foundation, it wasn't really true, right? It's much, much more complicated than that, and we'll get to that when we talk about Vietnam a little bit more. But remember, this is what people believed, and rarely does it truly matter if the truth is different, if what you believe to be true. I know that sounds a little confusing, but if you truly believe something to be true, you're going to operate under that assumption, right? And both the US and the USSR were doing so. Here we see a political cartoon. This is a Greek soldier viewing the menace of the Soviet bear, right? So again, many countries viewed the Soviets as trying to expand communism worldwide and therefore starting this whole domino theory. Okay, so in 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman issues the Truman Doctrine, which is basically kind of a statement that says we will support any country trying to resist communism. And this plays out first in Greece, in which there was an attempted communist revolution, and in Turkey. Now, while the Soviets did support these communist revolutions, remember that a lot of these things, especially with the Vietnam, were kind of happening on their own. It wasn't like a big mastermind done by the Soviet Union. They wanted it to happen, but it wasn't necessarily every single time something being carried out by the Soviet Union. Okay, and again, this whole idea of the Truman Doctrine is to stop the dominoes from falling, right? If we go in as soon as a country might fall to communism, right? So in Greece and Turkey, the U.S. sent troops, supplies, whatever they needed to help them prevent the spread of communism. The idea was, we'll stop the dominoes from falling. Okay, but like I said, it's all about point of view, right? From the US's perspective, on the right here, right, the Soviets, they're trying to conquer the world. Whereas from the Soviets' perspective, it's everyone's kind of closing in on them and threatening their way of life and their regime. Now, to be fair, we have to be honest about this. The Soviet Union was corrupt, and it was not good for its people. While some people may have benefited from it, largely it was not. People were killed without any sort of due process, right? A lot of the most lucrative financial instruments were held by a few wealthy people. It wasn't truly good for most people, right? But the point of view idea still stands, right? Both sides kind of view the opposite as the enemy. So then the war gets quote-unquote cold. Okay, so this starts with the atomic bombing of Japan. This announces the power of the U.S. to the world, that we have this massive weapon that can cause massive destruction, and it kind of strikes fear into the hearts of the Soviets, right? They're like, well, wait, we need to build some of these too, because the U.S. has them and we don't. The idea, if you guys remember from looking at kind of the causes of the or the decision to drop the bomb, the idea was to prevent the Russians from getting influence in Japan. At this point, the Russians had declared war on Japan and were seeking to control it. And essentially what would have happened to Japan is kind of what happened to Korea, where it would be half controlled by the Soviet or supported by the Soviet Union and half supported by the US and the West. Right? So the bombs were done to end the war as speedily as possible, amongst other reasons as well. it showed that the U.S. was willing to use kind of any means necessary to expand its power and to kind of express its will, right? And so again, for the Soviets, this was viewed as a negative thing, as a scary thing. By 1949, the Soviets built their own nuclear weapons. Again, for the US, this was now scary because it's like, okay, well, we can trust ourselves with the bombs, but we can't trust the Soviets, was the idea at the time, right? And so at this point, we have this arms race in which both sides were constantly building stronger and stronger weapons, building more and more weapons, right? By the end of the Cold War, there were thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons available to be used, right? And this was all done to kind of even the playing field, to always be on equal terms or ideally surpass the opposite side. Okay. So we then have a couple other conflicts. So when World War II ends, Germany split up into 4 zones. There's the Russian zone or the Soviet zone, there's the US zone, the French zone, the British zone. The US, French, and British zone would eventually be combined into West Germany, and the Russian zone would become East Germany. Well, Berlin was supposed to be also split into 4. West Berlin, or well, the French, British, and US side, which eventually become West Berlin and East Berlin. But the Russians were trying to basically force all of Berlin to fall to their control. And so they basically cut off all roads to Berlin to essentially starve them to submission. Well, the US and the West tried to basically counteract this by doing the Berlin airlift, in which the U.S. flew supplies to West Berlin. Now, this was a very risky attempt, right? Because had the Soviets shot down some U.S. planes, that could have immediately started World War III just 4 years after the end of World War II, right? But they chose to not shoot down the planes. I mean, neither side wanted to go to World War II. That's something or World War III, sorry. That's something to keep in mind. The U.S. was able to support West Berlin. West Berlin remained free compared to the Russian side. Okay, and we can see here on the map, right, the 2 sides of Berlin. Skip that. All right, and then finally we have economic aid that's being given to the various nations that were trying to resist communism. The biggest thing is the Marshall Plan, named after the guy who came up with it. Basically, the U.S. would give money to any non-communist country, but a country that was fighting communism. So, for example, Italy, there was a lot of pro-communist activity going on in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and so they got money from the U.S. The idea was, right, if people are happy, financially secure, not poor, they'll have less of a reason to turn to communism. The Soviet Union had their own plan called the Molotov Plan, which essentially did the same thing. However, the Soviet Union was a poorer country at this point, so the U.S. was able to offer more money to Western Europe, but remember, the Soviet Union also was trying to do the same thing. Okay, and here we see a cartoon in which the American taxpayer is telling Europe, keep pumping, right? Europe's trying to get to self-support, to not need the U.S. help anymore. Here's the Marshall Plan, the U.S. help. But the idea was to support Western Europe as long as possible so that they would not also fall to communism. Okay. By 1949, once the lines were drawn in the sand, the Soviets had nuclear weapons, we had nuclear weapons, we created 2 different alliances. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in 1949, and that had the Western democracies. Okay. Their goal was to help smaller countries resist communism. And then the Warsaw Pact was built in 1955, and that was the Soviet and Communist alliance in response to the Western NATO. Here we see the 2 sides. Okay. Then there's some major conflicts. We'll look at all of these a little bit more in detail next week. We have the Korean War, which is still very relevant today, so we'll talk about that for sure. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll learn more about that in U.S. history next year, but I'll briefly touch upon it next week. We have the Vietnam War, a very important and major war. Again, you'll talk about that more next year, but I will briefly touch upon it next week. And then finally, we have the Afghan War, which was essentially kind of the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and then we went in and tried to protect Afghanistan from falling to Soviet control. Again, we'll talk more about these all next week, but just kind of jot these down so you know that these are the major points. All right, so that's it for the slideshow. Go ahead and open up Google Docs or Google Classroom, and then you'll see the assignment for today. All right, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.